by Adolf Hitler, by Heinrich Himmler also, insisting on the fact that killing the Jews was the first step to erasing the Ten Commandments from German and European education. He saw the Jews as the bearers of what he called the European conscience, and it was negative in his views, and he insisted on the fact that he wanted to reinstate specific right of the German or Nordic man, as he said, the right to kill. Secondly, I will give you a few insights in the Holocaust decision-making. Historians, my fellow historians, would agree today to identify a few very important steps. And you know there has been a debate for years between scholars to know what was more important, the intention of Adolf Hitler or the general dynamic of the regime leading to the genocide. Well, we have to combine both to understand what happened. The first phase is between 1933 and 1938, what I call from mob anti-Semitism to state persecution. It's very important that you understand that Adolf Hitler wanted to develop a state persecution. For 5 years, he was looking for the right tool inside the German and Nazi dictatorship. With the Reichskristallnacht in 1938, with this national pogrom concerning all Jews in Germany and in Austria, he identified the SS as the most radical tool of his state anti-Semitism. Secondly, we have to take seriously what Hitler himself called his prophecy. It meant that he meant on the 30th of January 1939, on the 6th anniversary of his coming to power, that if there was to be a world war, the people responsible for the war would be the first victims of this war. Naturally, this was exactly the logic, the opposite of what would happen. Hitler wanted to declare war, and he wanted to kill the Jews. But it's very important to keep it in mind because it establishes the link between the war and the genocide. And I have not so much time to insist on it, but you have to keep in mind that there would have been no genocide on such a scale without the most terrible war in history, which not only unleashed the most horrible human instincts, but also which allowed the genocide in the Soviet Union first in the frame of the Russian-German war first, and then in Poland and in the rest of Europe. If you see 1939 as a break and with a clearly established intention before the start of the war, then you have to understand that between 1939 and 1941, before the unleashing of the war against the Soviet Union, the Nazis didn't know exactly how they would proceed, even if they wanted to kill the Jews. So you have different projects, intermediary projects. The so-called Judenreservat, the idea of identifying a territory in Poland where all European Jews would be sent and would die because of the extreme conditions. And then you have a second project after the victory over France, which is the project of a deportation of all European Jews to Madagascar. This was already a genocidal plan because they would be sent and die from the very harsh conditions there. But very important to know is that the planning of the Holocaust was undertaken by Reinhard Heydrich, the founder of the Gestapo and all terror instruments of the Third Reich, under the authority of Heinrich Himmler and Göring. And it's important to know that for years we thought we had lost the plan he sent to Himmler and Göring in January 1941. I belong to the historians having worked intensively on all Nazi documents, and I came to the conclusion that what we know as the protocol of the Wannsee Conference is actually this plan used again 1 year later in January 1942 with 3 steps. First, the Nazis would kill the Soviet Jews, then they would kill the Jews in Central Europe, and then they would kill all other European Jews. If we had time, I would show you how I came to this conclusion. But it's very important to understand that in Hitler's mind, the war with the Soviet Union would be very short, and that after 6 months or something like that, it would be possible to deport all European Jews towards the conquered territory in the East. What happened is that the war didn't stop at the end of 1941 as anticipated, and that the Nazis developed the extermination camps in Central Europe. Well, we are here together because on the 27th January 1945, the camp of Auschwitz was liberated. You know that there were 5 camps of extermination in Poland, Auschwitz, Belzec, Chełmno, Majdanek, and Treblinka. They were functioning from the autumn of. They were installed between the autumn of 1941 and the summer of 1942. But I want to insist on what has been discovered by recent research. If you heard about the extraordinary research led by Father Patrick Desbois and his research group in Yahad Enonum, this is what we call today, what the historians call today the Holocaust by bullets. These were the killing fields in the East. And we estimate today that 1/3 of the 6 million victims, approximately 2 million victims, didn't die in the concentration camps, but died in the killing fields of the former Soviet Union. And that Desbois and his team have been collecting 5,000 interviews of witnesses of these horrible events. I can only encourage you to go on the website of Yahad Enonum to know more. With an interactive map, you will see the scale of the massacre in Eastern Europe. Well. Last aspect, and we have no time to deal with it, but there will be plenty of examples, I think, in further presentations. You have to keep in mind that, well, we have a differentiated survivors rate according to the different countries. It has certainly to do with the commitment of the local population, of different institutions, the Catholic Church among them. But it had also to do with the presence or not of a direct Nazi and German domination. Otherwise, you wouldn't explain the two very different cases of the Netherlands, where only 25% of the Jews survived, in spite of the very brave commitment of many citizens, while in France, where there was for 2.5 years no direct occupation of southern France, up to 75% of the Jews were able to survive. I think that we will come back during the presentations to different aspects about it. Well, a last question I've been asked to speak about is the question which is very essential. It was mentioned by Gary Krupp about the non-action of different actors. Well, the pre-war period is essential to understand the different attitudes during the war. You have to keep in mind that after some protests, after some diplomatic messages and public statements in 1933, 1934, we have to see that, unfortunately, most governments didn't protest any further. Was there any protest after the racist laws of Nuremberg in 1935? Was there any boycott of the Olympic Games in 1936? because of the anti-Semitic persecution. Unfortunately not. And you know that 1938 was certainly the turning point. We will certainly have to answer today to the question about the perception of the Vatican of what happened in 1938, but we have to make the very sad statement that at the Conference of Evian in July 1938, the effort as the different powers gathered by President Roosevelt wanted to organize it, was extremely under the challenge of the situation. The United States decided to open their country to only 100,000 persecuted people, which led the other countries to say that they would do less. So we have to keep it in mind. The non-action leads us certainly to the question who knew what and when about the Holocaust. Well, we have the same phenomenon. People may have protested against deportation at the start, but at the end, nobody really took seriously the informations about the killings I mentioned earlier by the so-called Einsatzgruppen or other SS units, in spite of the many informations collected by German soldiers or by the Western government. And we know that from the summer of 1942, there were enough informations available about the extermination camps, available to the governments, and that unfortunately they didn't do much out of it. So we come to the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the liberation of the camps. It's true that the world could not ignore further the extent of the Nazi genocidal policy when looking at the images Gary Krupp was mentioning for Buchenwald, or the films and other images, pictures that were shown to the German public and to Western audiences. It's true. On the other side, we know how difficult it has been to fight with the truth until now, with some unnecessary controversy, as was mentioned about the question of the Vatican on one side, instead of going to the documents. On the other side, we have a much clearer view since the fall of the Soviet Union, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, thanks to the many researches which were undertaken in archives of countries of Eastern Europe and of the former Soviet Union. We know today most of what can be known, given the fact that most of the documents were destroyed by the Nazis. So these documents are well known, and I think now there's a lot of interpretation to be precise. I think we will have today a very intense and fascinating discussion about the particular example of what Catholics have been undertaking during the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your overview, presenting to us some of the background of the ideology that led to the Holocaust, and also the various historical developments that came before and led to the Shoah. We now turn to Professor Ronald Rychlak, Professor of Law and Government at the University of Mississippi Law School, and author of 3 major works: Hitler, the War and the Pope, Disinformation, and Righteous Gentiles, How Pius XII and the Catholic Church Saved 500,000 Jews from the Nazis. Also note that Professor Rychlak has served as a legal advisor with the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See for 2 decades. He will describe to us how Pope Pius XII, the Holy See and the Catholic Church in general eventually got the reputation for being complicit with Nazism and the Holocaust, which will set the stage for later presentations. His talk is addressed Soviet disinformation and the campaign against Pius XII. Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Father. I am honored to be here today in this building where I have long served as an advisor to the Holy See's mission, and to be among so many important scholars and researchers. My first book on this topic, Hitler, the War, and the Pope, came out in 2000, the same year my daughter Olivia was born, and the same year I first worked here for the mission. 7 years later, several people who knew about my work on Pope Pius XII called me to tell me about an article that had just appeared in National Review Online. It was written by a man named Jan Mihai Pacepa, former head of former intelligence under communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. According to Pacepa, the myth of Hitler's Pope was developed and cultivated by Soviet bloc intelligence officers. It was an act of disinformation that Pacepa himself had helped develop, and he now wanted to set the record straight. If Pacepa's account held water, that would change everything. If it didn't, well, we should know that too. I decided to look into it. First, about Pacepa. He was the highest-ranking Soviet bloc official ever to defect to the West. In a talk given in March 2017, British Lord Christopher Monckton called Pacepa, quote, the most influential man of the 20th century and arguably of the 21st. The reason is that Pacepa left life at the top of the Soviet world, a world in which he hobnobbed with Nikita Khrushchev, Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, and others, and at great personal risk, he came to the United States, where he explained to government officials exactly what efforts the Soviets were undertaking to undermine the United States, and he provided guidance on how to counter those efforts. Pacepa's information later formed the basis of his book, Red Horizons, which was translated into 28 languages and played a huge role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. United States President Ronald Reagan came to call this his Bible for dealing with dictators. The National Review Online article Pacepa had written about Pope Pius XII was worth investigating. Bill Donahue of the Catholic League offered to fund me if I would go to Russia to investigate its claims. I would have liked to have gone to Russia, but I told Bill I didn't know where to go, what to look for, or what I would see if I came across it. The KGB was probably pretty good about hiding evidence, and I didn't read Russian, so I'd have to start elsewhere. I went to the same place where I started my first work on the topic, our local public library. Within 20 minutes, I'd found a book in which a former KGB agent wrote about how he had co-opted a small publication and made it a reliable outlet of Soviet disinformation. I also knew that publication in question had published the anti-Pius XII article, had pushed that line strongly, the anti-Pius XII line. There was reason to continue this research. It took me about 2 years before I shared my research with anyone other than my wife, who's here with me. After all, I'd already written a book about Nazis in the Vatican. Did I really need to add in the Kremlin? Would people put me in a corner with a tinfoil hat? The problem was, the deeper I got into this, the more sense it made. The war between communism and the Catholic Church is almost as old as communism itself. In 1846, 2 years before Karl Marx published his Communist Manifesto, the Pope at the time, Pius IX, referred to, quote, that infamous doctrine of so-called communism, which is absolutely contrary to the natural law, and which, quote, would utterly destroy the rights, property, and possessions of all men. After World War II, the atheistic Soviet government found itself with dominion over deeply Christian nations in Central and Eastern Europe. In order to advance their communist doctrine, Soviet leaders would have to undermine the church. The best way, of course, would be to associate it with the Nazis. On June 3, 1945, Radio Moscow announced that Pope Pius XII had been Hitler's pope and suggested that he had been an ally of the Nazis during World War II. This was the first salvo in a calculated operation designed to smear not just a pope, not even just the Catholic Church, but ultimately Christianity and religion in general. But it fell flat. The Pope's support for the Allies and aid to victims during the war was still fresh in people's minds. They knew this man too well for the accusation to take hold. The Kremlin then decided to focus on church officials in the new Eastern European satellites. Croatian Cardinal, in America we say Stepanak, in Croatia they'd say Stepinac, Cardinal Benzente of Hungary, Cardinal Baran of Czechoslovakia, Cardinal Wyszynski of Poland were among those who were indicted as having been pro-Nazis. The cases varied slightly from one to the next, but in general, the new communist leaders seized power while comparing themselves favorably to the church leaders, saying that they, like the church, stood against Nazism. After a year or two, however, the church leaders started creating problems, and they had to be removed. The easiest way was by associating them with the Nazis. Let's look briefly at Cardinal Stepanak. Before coming to power, the communists had used Stepanak's speeches in their propaganda, as he often spoke out against the Nazi occupation and against violation of human rights committed by Croatian Nazis. Now, however, he was a threat. Yugoslavian leader Joseph Tito had him arrested in September 1946 and charged him with several crimes, including helping to organize Nazi crimes, collaboration with the Nazi puppet regime, and responsibility for crimes committed by chaplains in that puppet army. They gave Stepanak a show trial. Before and during that trial, Tito made speeches condemning both Stepanak and Pius XII as enemies of the Yugoslav government. The Vatican newspaper noted, quote, Tito was echoing the Moscow line. The Western press recognized the show trial as a fraud from the beginning. Many defense witnesses were prohibited from testifying, key prosecution evidence was manufactured, and witnesses were threatened. The courtroom was filled with communist agitators whose vocal demonstrations were heavily reported by the government-controlled media. Naturally, the court found Stepanak guilty, sentencing him to 16 years in prison. 5 years later, Stepanak was ill, and Tito feared a worldwide backlash if he died in prison, so he ordered Stepanak to be sent to house arrest in his native village. Stepanak died on February 10, 1960. Years later, tests conducted by Vatican officials indicated that he had been slowly poisoned, presumably by his captors. 25 years after his death, Stepanak's prosecutor acknowledged that Stepanak had been framed and that he was tried only because he refused to sever ties with Rome. The prosecutor said that if Stepanak had agreed to head an independent Catholic church, he would not have been brought to trial. Another senior legal official who had put together the case against Stepanak added, quote, the indictments were designed rather more for publicity than for legality. In 1992, Croatia came out from under the thumb of communism. One of the first acts of Parliament was to issue a declaration condemning the framing and, quote, the political trial and sentence passed on Cardinal Stepanak in 1946. The communists were able to frame Stepanak and the others by using judicial systems that they controlled. The same could not be done with Pius XII. He was not under their thumb. So they instead waited until he died and then launched a massive disinformation campaign against him, centered around a play known as The Deputy. For 20 years now, I've been writing and lecturing on Pius XII. The hardest question I ever got was about 15 years ago from an elderly priest in Nebraska or Oklahoma. It was one of those two states, I forget which. But after my talk, he asked why, with all the evidence I'd set forth about all the good work Pius XII had done, why had his reputation flipped so dramatically, like Gary talked about? At the liberation of Rome in 1944, at the end of war in 1945, at the time of his death in 1958, Pope Pius XII was hailed for his moral leadership, opposition to the Nazis, and support of the Jews. Tributes came from around the world, from all major Jewish groups and other groups. Then by 1963, he was branded as a silent observer, if not an active participant in genocide. 15 years ago, I gave the standard answer. It was the play, The Deputy, a fictionalized story attributed to a German playwright named Rolf Hochhuth. Of course, this was a very unsatisfying answer. A fictional theatrical production changed the world's view of reality. It was the answer, but it made no sense. The Deputy was a scathing indictment of the Pope's alleged indifference to the Holocaust. Although it was fictional, Hochhuth claimed it was based on provable facts and appended a text in which he argued that his depiction was justified by the historical record. This was a brilliant tactic. When historians pointed to clear errors, defenders of the play could explain them away because, after all, it was fictionalized, literary license. Yet it also claimed to be essentially true. It was long known that the deputy drew upon post-war communist propaganda. Pachepa, in National Review Online piece, however, was the first to reveal that the KGB constructed, produced, and promoted the play in order to discredit Pius XII, through him, the Catholic Church, Christianity, and religion itself. As I researched his revelation, I learned that the German producer of the play, Erwin Piscator, reworked the play significantly. He changed it from an 8-hour monstrosity that seems to have been written by committee in the Kremlin into a more manageable 2-hour production. Piscator, by the way, had long acknowledged his desire to use theater to advance the communist cause, and he even had staged plays under orders from the Communist Party. The theater at which the deputy first opened was dedicated to the purpose of spreading pro-communist propaganda into West Germany. The American producer who brought the deputy to Broadway had been fined and given a suspended criminal sentence by the House Un-American Activities Committee due to his communist ties. The American publisher of the deputy was an acknowledged communist who specialized in radical books. The French translator was a member of the Spanish Communist Party Politburo and had for several years organized clandestine activities for that organization. This was at a time when people did not freely admit to communist ties, certainly in the United States. The play was promoted with Soviet-style propaganda. Many of the early positive reviewers had communist ties. At least one was paid by the KGB. Another was a former KGB spy. The play would not have opened on Broadway but for support from a supposed Catholic magazine called Ramparts that was falling under communist influence at the time. Rolf Hochhuth, to whom authorship is usually attributed, was an easy target for a KGB-style operation. He was an unknown writer who had never published a play. His research methods were sloppy at best, resulting in a significant legal verdict against him for his work on his next play, Soldiers. After The Deputy was written, he worked closely with his lifelong friend, noted Holocaust denier David Irving, whom Hochhuth has frequently defended. In 1969, a top-secret British intelligence report said, quote, "There are various grounds for suspecting, but no real proof, that Hochhuth's and Irving's activities are part of a long-term Soviet disinformation operation against the West." Another declassified secret report said, quote, It can also be argued that Hochhuth is engaged in some decomposition exercise and that he is attempting to destroy the fundamental value of a free society from its religions to its heroes." The report went on to speculate that Hochhuth might be an intellectual agent writing either on behalf of the East Germans or the Soviets. It concluded, quote, "Whether Hochhuth is motivated only by the urge to write historical plays, to rehabilitate the Germans, or is up to some more sinister game is difficult to determine at this stage, but the Russians are certainly reaping some of the benefit." British intelligence had figured out what was going on. They couldn't prove it at the time, but once you realize that the deputy was a Soviet plot designed to discredit the Catholic Church and religion itself, it becomes much easier to understand how a theatrical play could change the perception of Pius XII from the great benefactor of humanity to something far more sinister. And that's the answer I put forward in the second edition of Hitler, the War, and the Pope. Pachepa and I elaborated on that work in our co-authored book, Disinformation. The change in public perception regarding Pius XII was not organic. It was orchestrated from Moscow. It was designed to discredit the Church, regardless of the truth of the matter. We should all be glad that Pachepa came forward to expose this important historical fraud. By the way, the Stepanek case I discussed earlier continues to spread communist disinformation into the history of Pius XII. In the 1960s, Italian writer Carlo Falconi wrote The Silence of Pius XII, a book entirely based on documents provided to him by the communist government of Croatia. including those used to frame Stepanak. In his foreword, Falcone explained that, quote,